Everybody for joining us this afternoon for the second session in the Diversifying into Horticulture webinar series. So today it's navigating the planning process. And we've got Lucie Taylor here from Social Farms and Gardens, who's going to do a presentation with you to go through all things planning. I'm just going to go through the housekeeping notes first of all. So all attendees are asking you to mute yourselves during the meeting, and you can use the chat box to submit questions during the presentation today, but at the end you can unmute yourself and ask questions directly to the speaker. I think Lucie has got a gap in her presentation where you can ask questions in the middle as well, but she'll inform you how to do that. We will be recording the session today, and we will be posting it on the Tyfu Cymru Knowledge Hub in the next couple of days. If for any reason you don't want to be recorded, we're asking people to switch their cameras off, so your face not on it unless you don't mind, but if there are any problems, then please just let us know directly after the session so we can make any changes. And if you do accidentally leave the meeting, you can rejoin using the same link. And I just wanted to mention that the next session, these two have switched around. The next one we will be running is the hiring, leasing land contracts and insurances session, and that's happening on Tuesday the 23rd of March at 4 p.m. and you're going to be able to sign up for that session on our website from tomorrow. I think you're all aware of what Tyfu Cymru do by now, but if after this session you would like to sign up for full support if you're not already, then please get in touch with us at tyfucymru@lantra.co.uk. So I will now hand over to Lucie for her presentation. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, can everyone see that all right? Yeah, okay. Hang on a sec, just going to work out how to move it. Right, okay. So I'm Lucie Taylor, I work for Social Farms and Gardens, and I do 3 hours a week for Tyfu Cymru, helping groups, helping growers with their planning queries. And there's a lot of resources on this sort of thing up on our Social Farms and Gardens website. And as Hannah's mentioned, this presentation will be up on the Knowledge Hub, Lantra Knowledge Hub. But we're also doing two sort of info sheets to accompany this presentation, this webinar, which will also be up there as well. So just moving forward, what we're going to be discussing today is very much about sort of development advice for growers who are sort of thinking about diversifying from maybe another sort of area of farming and starting up into horticulture in a commercial sense. We'll talk about what is development, you know, and the starting point of assessing whether you need planning permission and you know, the permitted development rights that we have here in Wales, whether you need permission for change of use of land. I'll take some questions then, and then we'll move on then to the second sort of half of talking about how to obtain planning permission, and some tips and hints as to some of the things that you can do to help yourself through the process. So what is development? Basically, when you're working out whether you need planning permission, the first starting point is to say, well, is this thing I want to do, the works that I want to do, are they development? And if they are development, are they permitted development? So the first bit, is it development? This is the sort of town and country planning definition of it. The carrying out of building, engineering, mining or other operations in, on, over or under land, and the making of any material change of use of any building or land. So I think best starting point really is to say that you should assume that all buildings and operations and changes of use that you might want to do require planning permission. And you know, obviously I've been giving you some advice here, but it's best to sort of speak to your local planning authority before you carry out any works. So just moving on to structures. Now this area of planning, there's not very much guidance around it, and there's a simple reason why. It's a very grey area as to what amounts to development, and whether a structure is development. It's very much a matter of fact and degree, looking at the scale of what you're wanting to build, the weight, and whether that is easy to move around or pick up and sort of take off the site without having to dismantle it, and also the bulk of the building. So if you're thinking about sort of raised beds, shelters, and sort of polytunnels, you know, something like the polytunnel in the right hand corner of this slide perhaps would be, you know, of a small scale and weight and bulk that wouldn't amount to development. And likewise with the raised beds, perhaps 2 or 3 of those sort of raised beds wouldn't necessarily amount to development. And we have had word from local planning authorities in Wales that do agree with that. But then, you know, I've been speaking to a CSA wanting to set a community supported agriculture scheme that wants to set up in Swansea at the moment. Well, they're thinking about sort of 60 raised beds because the land's contaminated. So that, you know, is something quite clearly is development that will probably need a planning application. The things that are so small that don't need planning permission, they call it de minimis. It doesn't warrant the intervention of the local planning authority, just because of, you know, the height and the impact of the structure in terms of any impact in the landscape or on neighbouring properties. Moving on to other things that might amount to development. Engineering operations. These are things like, you know, a pond that you might want to create for various reasons, or excavation for, you know, terracing on a hill, and also things like hard standing areas for car parking, or the creation of an access way. Those are all things that sort of engineering operations that require quite a bit of digging, and again, that's a matter of fact and degree, but you know, the bigger the structure, the bigger the pond or the terracing, it's likely to amount to development that might need planning permission. So just moving on to permitted development. So if you establish that your polytunnel or your greenhouse or raised beds are developments, there are permitted development rights that different types of development are granted, so that a formal planning application is not required. Now, the planning system, particularly in Wales, is a little bit behind on, a little bit antiquated on the rights for small scale farmers. And we've been doing a bit of canvassing of Welsh Government in that respect. But one of the things that everybody more or less has permitted development rights for is things like forms of enclosure. So if you want to put up a gate, fence or wall that's below 1 metre in height, adjacent to a road that's used by vehicle traffic, so that you can go up to 1 metre in height adjacent to a road, and 2 metres in height elsewhere. As far as I can see, the only place that doesn't apply is if you're within the curtilage of a listed building. So yeah, it's a very common automatic right of planning permission, that if you want to put up a small wall or fence that's below 1 metre or 2 metres. There's also something called where you want to create an access to a highway. You can put like a gate or a new access point in if it's in connection with another bit of development that's also permitted development, and that could be a hard standing area, for instance. So there are instances where you could put a new highways access in as well, but it can't be on an A or a B road. So check that would need checking. Now, temporary buildings. There's quite a lot of myths about what are temporary buildings. It's not something that planners, as a town planner, wording that we use very much. It's very limited. You can have temporary buildings in association with development that's already got planning permission. So things like a compound for, when housing developers are developing new housing estates, they always have an area of a sort of a compound area where they put all their machinery. They might have a little office for the staff and toilets and that sort of thing. Those sorts of things are allowed. They're temporary structures in association with a development that's got planning permission. You can also use a piece of land, so change of use, if you like, from a farm to maybe some sort of entertainment facility for 28 days a year. That's use of land. This isn't structures now. You can use land for 28 days in a calendar year, but the land mustn't be, some very random things here, can't be within triple SSI, which is a particular designation for nature conservation. Can't be for motorsports, can't be for clay pigeon shooting, war games or adverts. So that's a bit random, but yeah, as you can see, there's some very limited things around temporary buildings and uses of land. When people say, oh, that's just a shed, surely it's just a temporary structure, that doesn't really ring true with planners. The test is whether that shed is development or not, and whether there is a class of permitted development that allows it not to have a formal planning application submitted for it. So yeah, it's very much a test as to whether it is development or permitted development, not whether it's a temporary structure or not. So just moving on, the change of use side of things. So if you're wanting to create a business around horticulture, and you're talking about changing a field, blank field for growing fruit and veg, that is agriculture, and agriculture is not within the meaning of development. Therefore, it doesn't require a change of use application. And we've had confirmation of that from local authorities and particularly Welsh Government in more recent months, that is the case. So if you want to grow food on an area of land, it's not development, no change of use is required. But there may be other things you want to do, like set up a little farm shop, or just have an area for workshops or training, for instance. Then as long as that use is very small and ancillary to the main use of the site or field, you're probably okay. It is a matter of fact and degree, and you should probably, you should speak to your local planning authority before you start thinking about changing the use of any buildings or areas of land. But always trying, downplay the amount of the impact of that use in the context of the overall use. that you've got on your land. So if your main use is horticulture, always keep that main use. This picture is some of you may recognise is Tom O'Kane at Kaitan on the Gower, and when we submitted his applications with him, he you know, they were very much like, well, you want to do training on the land, and this sounds a bit more like an education type use. And he was like, no, it's very much, we're talking about growing here, and that is very much an ancillary part to what we're doing. We're just adding a bit of community sort of uses on top of our horticultural business. Now, so that's change of use. There are some farming permitted development rights, which again we've been canvassing Welsh Government to change, because farms under 5 hectares or 12.4 acres don't have very limited permitted development rights to build structures and do engineering operations, compared to what the rights are for farmers operating on farms over 5 hectares. Just to mention that there are some new permitted development rights that came out on the 21st of December for community growers. So if you're wanting to set up a community supported agriculture scheme, for instance, or something that involves the community and you're growing, then you can build, I mean, if you're over a certain amount, I think it's about 120 meters squared, which is a very small area, really. If you're looking at commercial growing, you could have a shed and a greenhouse up to 6 meters squared. So we're talking about very small structures here, but it is worth noting that that's the fallback position. Community growers do have those rights to build very small structures now. So moving on to farms over 5 hectares, you can build new structures up to 465 square meters, which is quite a substantial sized building, actually. You can alter or extend existing buildings, and you can carry out certain engineering operations within certain criteria, of course, without planning permission. You would just need to submit a prior notification application before you start works. That's very important that you do that before you start works, because if you start works, you then need to apply for full planning permission. The prior notification application is just a sort of 28-day assessment. They have 28 days to determine the application. It's a lot cheaper planning application, just to assess whether they want, if there's anything that concerns them that might warrant a full planning application. It's unusual that they ask for a full planning application where farmers have these rights. So yeah, there's quite a lot you can do. I should just mention that in national park areas, you do, and certain areas around Snowdonia National Park, you do need to submit a prior notification application for any new structures, as well as sort of alterations and extensions and anything like new paths as well. So that it is quite strict in terms of sort of alterations and extensions for national park areas. Under 5 hectares, you can't build any new structures without a full planning application. So you don't have any permitted development rights, apart from those little ones that we mentioned about the up to 6 meters squared for a shed and a greenhouse, if you're doing something that's sort of community supported agriculture. You can't do any engineering operations, so you can't do things like ponds that amount to development. You would need a full planning application for. You can alter and extend existing structures, and you can have some hard surfaces as well within certain criteria. And as I said, within national parks, you do need to submit a full a prior notification application for even altering and extending. existing structures. Okay, that's quite a lot to take in. So any questions at this stage? Hannah, has anything come up in the chat?
No, nothing at the moment. I was just going to ask you actually, it's really good news about the community, the under 6 meters square, which is really good. Do you think that's going to make a lot of difference to a lot of enterprises getting off the ground?
Well, it's such a small
yeah.
amount that we're talking about. In fact, some of the structures probably wouldn't necessarily amount to development, especially on larger farm. You know, if you've got, say, I don't know, 4 to 6 acres of a field that you're wanting to set up on, and you want to put a small shed up 6 meters squared, I think a lot of authorities might say it doesn't even amount to development.
Overlook it. Yeah.
But the really good thing about it is that community growers now is confirmation that they are carrying out agriculture just as farmers are, and therefore they don't need this change of use application. We've had problems with local authorities questioning that, particularly up in Gwynedd Council, who were, you know, a change of use application is more expensive as well. It costs £460, you know, and it's just gave confirmation that any form of growing is agriculture and doesn't need a change of use. So that's been very helpful, and it's a step in the right direction for horticulture in general, really, that you know, we are starting to think more positively about small scale farming. Planners, I think, have been very sort of used to traditional farming type applications on very big farms, monoculture sort of you know, cattle sheds and those sorts of things. So it's good to see that this is being recognised, but they do need a lot more guidance, planning officers, to come out of Welsh Government.
Yeah.
But we'll talk maybe a little bit more about that. But yeah, it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, it is. Do you think there'll be more? Do you think things will start shifting in that direction, or do you think it's still going to be a bit of a battle?
I think it's going to be very helpful for people, advocates and agents,
yeah.
you know, but it's going to be difficult. It's still going to be difficult from, you know, for your average small scale farmer to submit a little planning application. They think it's not going to make much of be much of a problem. There's planning policy guidance from Welsh Government, the Technical Advice Note 6 on sustainable rural communities, that is in desperate need of update to provide more guidance for planning officers, which talks more about, you know, the benefits of small scale farming, and that they, you know, planners need to recognise that you don't necessarily have to be on hundreds of acres to make a farm, a commercial business successful.
Yeah.
Which I think that's what they do very much suspect sometimes with these smaller scale operations, that you're just doing a bit of hobby farming.
Hobby farming, yeah. Yeah.
Which really
it's just not the case at all.
really
and there's enough evidence out there to show that it's not hobby farming, and you can make, you know, a successful business from it. And the other, I was just going to say, is that that change with the 6 meter square, does that also apply in national parks and areas of national beauty?
No, I don't think it does. I think they're excluded, yeah, because Brecon Beacons National Park were quite keen to say that they needed to control things. So I think that's that they have in national parks.
We've got one question just pop up here from Emma. Would a prior planning notice be required for a new short access track? The farm is greater than 5 hectares, but the market garden is less than 1 acre.
Hi, Emma. I used to work with Emma.
Hi, Lucy. Hi.
Hi. It's there are permitted development rights for sort of hard standing track areas. Do your best to sort of say that you're operating on the larger farm side of things, rather than just the 1 acre. I think, yeah, well, I'm not gonna have a look at it for you, but it sounds like you might be all right, because if you're operating on the larger farm, if we use that sort of acreage, it could be a bit more of a positive outcome. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Luce. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll hand back over to you, Lucie, to carry on.
All right. Okay. So getting planning permission, how do you go about it? See if I can give you some tips. We'll talk about some pre-application advice and actually to how best to sort of do things. I think one of the big things really is to start right. If you don't start right, then that can make a big difference as to whether you're going to be successful in your planning application. Anyway, some tips. You don't need to own land to get planning permission. So if you see a bit of land and you think the landowner is sort of interested in giving you some land, you can get your planning application in straight away. Because you don't need to own land. You just serve notice on the owner and sign a little certificate in the planning application forms. So that's quite a good thing to know. The objection of neighbours doesn't necessarily impact the planning decision. What they say has to be a material planning consideration, which we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. And also it's always a balance that local planning authorities have to make. The planning officer will make a recommendation either to his head of planning or to the planning committee, depending on level of objections usually. And it's a balance really. They will take into account neighbour objections if they are material planning considerations, but it's the officer that has to make that sort of judgment in terms of a recommendation. You can withdraw an application at any time prior to decision, and if you don't think your planning application is going in the right direction, the planning officer doesn't like it, you can resubmit an application sort of within a year for no fee. So you could withdraw an application and start again in sort of 6 months with no fee, planning application fee. You can submit as many applications at the same time, one after another. Big housing developers and commercial developers do this quite a lot. They might put in their optimum scheme and then maybe put one in that's more likely to be approved. And then if the optimum scheme's refused, they take it to appeal, let the other one run, and you're just hedging your bets a little bit, so that you're playing the system a little bit, and you can sometimes get your optimum scheme at appeal. Don't bother with outline planning permission. These days it's quite unusual to go for outline planning permission. Pre-application advice is a good way of doing things, and it's often cheaper. Local development plan. Every local authority has, including national parks, have a local development plan. Check the policies. Don't even think about buying or entering into a legal agreement on a piece of land without looking in the local development plan as to the acceptability of, if you're going to do a commercial operation, you're probably going to need to put some structures or do some potential engineering operations to have things the way you want to. It could be quite critical to the success of the business. So yeah, really check those local development plan policies. It can be a little bit hard to find the right policies for development in the countryside. Planning policy sections can be particularly helpful in that regard. You can give them a call, speak to the local planning policy officers and just say, look, I'm intending to do this. They do like to see a location plan. A lot of you know, in social farms and gardens, a lot of the community growers I deal with, you know, that they don't have plans, and that makes things a lot more difficult because planners won't even look at anything without some sort of a location or layout plan. So yeah, have a location plan. Say, I want to do this here. What sort of policies in the local development plan would be applicable? That's their job. It's a perfectly legitimate, reasonable question for you to ask a planning officer. So use them and see what policies would apply. And then you can also get pre-application advice, which we'll talk about going in the next couple of slides. Oh, the next slide. Pre-application advice, there's a statutory process now across Wales. All local planning authorities have to give pre-application advice if they're asked to by the applicant. They have 21 days in which to give that advice. There's a statutory fee of £250 up to half a hectare, I think that is. And then there's some local authority planning departments do have a discretionary pre-application advice process as well, which sometimes can be a little bit cheaper. But yeah, it's usually all on their website as to how to go about getting pre-application advice. It's a good idea, but I would say speaking to your planning policy officer first to find out if a structure is going to be acceptable is an even better starting point, at least, because you don't have to pay for that. That's how I go about it. And have a look at the planning history, you know, of your site, but also if you can see a similar structure or scheme in the local area, look it up on their planning application web pages. If you just type in, say it's Rhondda and Taff Council, type in to Google Rhondda and Taff planning application search, and it'll take you straight to their pages and where you can view previous and current planning applications. So that's something that you can do as well yourself without any fees. I always look at, when I'm doing that, I'll always look at the officer report. On every planning application, officers have to write a report, either to their planning committee or to their head of planning, who has delegated powers to determine certain planning applications. And that officer report will take you through what the policy considerations are, you know, what the local development plan says about that type of development, if there are likely to be any objections in the area. You can see whether somebody objected to a plan application locally of a similar type. Yeah, it's just useful to have a look at the planning history. You get a lot of information from the officer report, and it'll tell you all the material planning considerations as well. So yeah, that officer report is useful. Right. I was just going to say as well that there may be supplementary planning guidance on the planning policy pages as well. If you look up local development plan or you type in supplementary planning guidance on the council website, there may be things like for barn conversions or particular types of development in the open countryside. There might be specific policy documents that have been written about that type of development. National parks are particularly keen to do that sort of thing. Yeah, always check. Always check to see what plans and information will be required. You know, it's important to have the right types of drawings. They'll always ask for a location plan, a block plan, and then some kind of side or front elevation plans. If you're wanting to put in a pond, for instance, then they'll ask for sort of cross-section plans through, you know, how deep the pond is going to be. And then you use the planning portal to submit your application. The portal is very good for helping you go through the application process. It just takes you through the pages one by one. And everyone seems to submit on the planning portal these days, especially in the current times. So yeah, I'll take you through the form. It then tell you what plans are needed, and it will also tell you what the fee is. You'll need to sign a certificate to say, as I mentioned before, if you don't own the land entirely, if there's tenants or another landowner, you need to sign certificate B to say that you serve notice on them. You don't need their permission, you just need to say that you served this notice. And it's a particular, I think it's called App 1 form on the Wales planning portal website. There's a validation process where planning administration officers will have a look at what you've submitted, and they'll assess whether you've submitted all the right documentation. And if you haven't, they will register the application and allocate a planning officer to it even. So they'll send you a letter back saying you haven't done this. Can you rectify the situation before we register it? From the date of registration, you get a planning officer, and they get, usually for minor development, 8 weeks in which they're supposed to try and decide applications. They can't go over, and they have to just write you a short letter asking for an extension of time. So just moving on now to planning considerations. As I said, every local authority has a local development plan. So those are important policies. They're the first port of call for planning applications. The planning officer will look in that document. That's a bit of a Bible, really. They'll also look at Technical Advice Note 6, which is something Welsh Government have written about sustainable rural communities. It in desperate need of update, in my opinion. But does have some bits and bobs in there about the type of thing that is acceptable, and the types of sort of consideration that we're looking at for that those specific types of proposals in the countryside. If you're not familiar, most development is directed towards towns and cities and villages, where a settlement boundary is drawn around the outside of that settlement, and everything beyond that line is sort of deemed to be countryside, where strict policy applies, and usually only things like agriculture, outdoor recreation and tourism are acceptable in those sorts of locations. And One Planet development we have here in Wales as well, but that can be very difficult to obtain planning permission for. So one of the first things that they will assess is whether the proposed development is reasonably necessary for what you want to do on the land. And they'll probably be a little bit suspicious of small scale farmers setting up, they'll want to make sure that is adding something to the rural economy, and therefore a rural location is needed. What that, if you want to put up a polytunnel, do you really need a polytunnel for the operation of that business? Well, clearly it is going to be quite essential, isn't it? But don't be too surprised if they ask you for some kind of management or business plan as to how you're going to be, how much money you're going to be making in your first, second and third years. It's good to be in a position to provide that information, so they can see that this is a commercial operation and it does need a rural location. there will be things like siting design and external appearance that will be considered, and they'll want to make sure that if you're, for instance, setting up a farm shop, it's not too remote and not attracting too much traffic to a rural location. You're supposed to look for rural development that's sustainable, so it doesn't generate too much use by travelling by car. But there are things in TAN 6 that do allow for exceptions to that, and that some leniency is required for farmers operating in countryside locations. So that can be argued, but I'm just flagging it up as something. If it's particularly remote, they may want to check that not too many people are travelling to that remote location, because it's not encouraged in town and country planning in the UK. So they won't want to see too much of an intrusion in the landscape, and obviously national park or areas of outstanding natural beauty are particular sensitivities around that area, but just making sure that perhaps the building is forming part of a group of other buildings, it's not above the skyline, and you know, it's the buildings of a traditional rural character, so they wouldn't want to see anything too domestic. Sometimes domestic sheds for gardens and things like that can be a little bit raise an eyebrow with planners, that it's not the type of structure you would look to see in a rural location, because you're used to seeing farm buildings. Orientation of your building can obviously be very important in terms of heat and ventilation, so that might be something you want to just flag up in a little statement along with your contribution to the rural economy, and the things that, you know, you're doing something that is necessary in its rural location, and just say why you need to put it in that particular location, and orientate it in that way. So the main considerations are sort of siting design and appearance, the principle of development, whether it's reasonably necessary for its countryside location, any impact on neighbours. Obviously, if you wanted to set up a chicken farm, those sorts of things are particularly offensive to neighbours these days, aren't they? But perhaps our horticultural businesses won't necessarily have so much of an impact on neighbours. Highways, as we've mentioned, not too much of an impact there. Ecology, nature, biodiversity, making sure that if you're converting existing buildings, that there aren't bats roosting, those sorts of things. Barn owls and bats are safeguarded by law, so just be very careful if you're converting existing buildings. Yeah, always, obviously, I mean, most small-scale farmers these days are very mindful of habitats and biodiversity, but just always have that in the back of your mind as to whether it might be something the planners might want to see, you know, an ecological impact report, for instance. So it can be something that comes up. Now, just in terms of national park policies and areas of outstanding natural beauty, you know, you need to just have a little bit more of a careful think about, you know, the natural beauty of that area, and any particular wildlife that's of note in those areas. Cultural heritage as well is a big thing in national parks, particularly. And I know in Brecon, particularly, they're keen to make more secure future in terms of local food production. So there can be some very positive policies as well that encourage this sort of thing, that you can highlight. I think Welsh Government is trying to direct planning officers to be more mindful that farm diversification and new types of farming are going to be needed going forward. So, you know, any wording of that nature in the development plan or in national planning policy guidance. There's Planning Policy Wales, which I should mention, which is the headline document for all the sort of technical advice notes. Obviously TAN 6 in this instance, but Planning Policy Wales is an up-to-date document. Opportunity missed in terms of agriculture, in my view again, but they do talk about things like being mindful that new types of farming are going to be needed, and yeah, don't go for lots of hard standing areas. If you wanting to create huge areas of sort of parking, for instance, those are the types of things that will raise an eyebrow with planners. They don't want to see one of the main objectives of the countryside and national parks is to protect the openness of those areas and the natural beauty. So hard standing areas can, they would only want to see what is absolutely necessary, not changing the landscape too much. And of course, anything that does have a lot of hard standing areas means that you're going to be having a lot of people coming to the site, and that's not something they particularly want to see in countryside locations. So just keep it small and be mindful of those sorts of things that planners will want to just keep it minimal, especially when you're starting out. I know with some of the schemes I've dealt with on community supported agriculture schemes that have started out, they've gone for minimal stuff to start with because the planners need to build trust. Really, they need to know that you're showing your worth and you are adding to the rural economy. So if there's other things that you want to do, you can apply years down the line. It's best to just sort of go in with sort of small bits of development to start with, because it will be quite alien to them, this type of farming. It shouldn't be, but it's getting better, but it's not something they're particularly used to seeing, is what I'm saying. So keep it minimal and a bit respectful of the landscape. And any questions on that aspect of things? I don't think I missed anything out.
Thanks, Lucy. How old is the Planning Policy Wales document, and are you expecting any revisions to that or any of the sort of development plan policies in Wales? I was particularly interested in the permitted development rights that weren't applicable to the less than 5 hectare farms. I was just wondering whether there are, any expected sort of revisions to these policies that would enable more sort of permissive rights to the smaller scale farms, and any updates on the policy front, really.
I mean, the permitted development rights for farmers under 5 hectares is something that I've been banging on to Welsh Government about for a long time, and not had any luck. I have taken this to ministerial level a couple of times, and we're just told that they, planning division have other more pressing priorities. But with Leslie Griffiths' agricultural agenda in terms of wanting to make food production more sustainable and environmentally friendly, planning division have got some serious catching up to do, and it is going to happen, but it's a big piece of work. I mean, they could just what they've done in Scotland, you see, is just instead of that 5 hectare threshold, they've reduced it to 0.1 of a hectare. And it's been like that for about 18 years and it doesn't seem to have created any problems. So they could just do that. But it probably needs a bit of an overhaul all round, to be honest with you, those permitted development rights for agriculture. I noticed with the ones for community projects, they're much more mindful of flooding and things that are close to rivers and that sort of thing. They've put a criteria in there for anything that's sort of within 8 meters of a tidal river and things like that. So yeah, that's quite a big agenda for agriculture these days, So they might want to overhaul permitted development rights more thoroughly than just reducing the threshold. But it's not going to happen anytime soon. We've got an election coming up, so things could change in terms of the administrations. In terms of planning policy, Wales, that's a policy document. It's not legislation. I think it was written in 2019, so it's quite new. And we did submit representations to it, but not much is said in any regard to sort of small scale farming and the like, which is why TANSIT, the Technical Advice Note 6, which is 10 years old now, is such a big opportunity for small scale farmers to have some really good guidance on the types of development planning officers should be looking to approve in the event that planning application is required. So yeah, it's a big step in the right direction was the community support, the community permitted development rights for community growers. And there's that fallback position now, isn't there? They know that at least you can have those structures, and the principle of it being agriculture is already there now. We've got that signed in sort of stone, really. So that's really good. I think one of the things that planning officers are most suspicious about is are you a real business? You're not just setting up a hobby farm for yourself at a bit of small holding. They'll want to see, some sort of business proposal idea to show what you're going to be doing and how you're going to be contributing to the economics of the area, and that's why you need to be in that rural location, and therefore perhaps have a polytunnel, which is absolutely essential to a horticultural business. Those things, it has to all be reasonably necessary, and it has to be something that is warranted in that rural location. And they seem very suspicious, or have been in the past, suspicious of farming operations that are small scale, because they're not actual sort of businesses, they're not farming units. So we do have some good examples now, but it can still be a bit of a battle with some local authorities.
Have we got any other questions for Lucie before we round up? I know we're in a small group here today, but this will be going up, as I say, on the Knowledge Hub, so everybody can who couldn't make it this afternoon can watch back. So yeah, I just want to thank Lucie very much for a very thorough presentation with some fantastic advice. Particularly, I like the start small and be mindful. It's a good motto there. And it's great to have an insight into how planning officers are thinking. So that's really, really good. We do offer one-to-one sessions with Lucie that can be arranged through Tyfu Cymru. They are limited, so if anybody here today or anybody watching back would like some one-to-one advice from Lucie, then do get in touch with us, and we can arrange that. And I will send out an email later this week, which will have the links to the next 2 sessions in this webinar series. So thanks again, Lucie, and thanks everybody else for joining us today.
Oh yeah, thanks for joining us. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye.